In the House Select Subcommittee on the coronavirus pandemic hearing on proximal origins that took place yesterday, Representative Jim Jordan questioned witness Dr. Christian Anderson, one of the authors of the proximal origin paper, on the possibility that COVID came from a lab leak. Let's watch.
You guys don't know whether they were doing gain-of-function research or not. You think they weren't. I think they were. You think they weren't. But regardless of that, what they were doing there, what the biosafety level at that lab wasn't up to the code it should have been for the research they were doing.
Doing this type of research at BSL-2 using bat coronaviruses is commonly done at BSL-2. The lab work, the animal work, I should say, is done in BSL-3. Again, this is all available.
What level lab would you want? If you're doing the research, Dr. Anderson or Dr. Gary, what level lab, what level would you want, 2 or 3?
This would again typically be approved at biosafety level 2. However, as I said from the beginning, is that I believe, especially given everything we know based on how many of these coronaviruses we have, that this kind of work should in future, via international regulations, be done at BSL-3.
Should be done at a higher level than it was done there.
U.S. Right to Know reporter Emily Komp tweeted this question that was posed to Anderson and Dr. Robert Gary, another author of the paper. Did you advise the intelligence community on their assessment of COVID's origins? Gary and Anderson both said yes, the FBI and CIA.
Anderson also responded to allegations about Dr. Fauci's connection to the proximal origins paper.
The claim that Dr. Fauci prompted the drafting of proximal origin to disprove the lab leak is not true. In an email to the journal Nature, I stated, prompted by Jeremy Farrar, Tony Fauci, and Francis Collins, we have been working through much of the primarily genetic data to provide agnostic and scientifically informed hypotheses around the origin of the virus. There was no prompting to disprove or dismiss a potential lab leak. In fact, when I outlined my initial hypothesis about a potentially engineered virus, Dr. Fauci told me, and I'm paraphrasing here, if you think this virus came from a lab, you should write a scientific paper about it. This is textbook science in action. Some have alleged that I have received a federal grant in exchange for the conclusions made in our proximal origin paper. There is no connection between the grant and the paper. Funding decisions on the grant were made before the pandemic, months before the February 1 conference call.
Molecular biologist and scientific advisor at the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, Alina Chan, joins us now to weigh in. Welcome, Alina.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so take us through what you believe the biggest kind of admissions or bits of new information coming out of this hearing were yesterday.
So this hearing did not tell us about the evidence that has led the FBI and the Department of Energy to assess that a lab origin is more likely than a natural origin. But it did show us that this group of experts were not very transparent in how they came to publish a very prominent letter dismissing all lab-based scenarios. So they acknowledged during the hearing, they were questioned and forced to acknowledge that, yes, that lab was working with dangerous viruses at low biosafety, that they did not have access to the experiments or types of viruses being worked with in that lab, and yet they pushed out a letter claiming that they can dismiss lab origins based on their own professional opinion. So based on not any facts or evidence that they had access to, but based on their own opinions. One thing that was really surprising to me was that this group of influential scientists included funders of the Wuhan Institute, and in their query of whether the virus had escaped from that, did not look within their own records, did not do their own searching to see whether they had progress reports or proposals from the EcoHealth Alliance and the WIF to see whether they might have had such a virus in their collection.
I believe yesterday as well we saw a report being produced discussing by the House discussing the topic of proximal origins, and we saw some messages that maybe have been out there, but I hadn't seen Slack messages among these scientists discussing almost reasons to root against a lab leak explanation, because then there will be more scrutiny on grant making in the future. Can you speak to that aspect of it?
So we've seen a lot of these emails and Slack messages acquired by the Select Subcommittee on the Origins, what they show is that even all the way till mid-February, these authors of Proximal Origin, they knew that they could not distinguish between an accidental lab escape and a natural virus jumping from an animal to a human in the market. But by the time they put out their letter, they had put in such a forceful statement saying that it's not plausible that this virus came from a lab. And this contradicts all of their private thoughts. And we see from their private exchanges that they were very worried about a shit show, in their own words, that would happen if anyone serious dared to accuse the Chinese of even an accidental lab escape. So we can see that in their minds, it wasn't just the scientific evidence they were thinking about, that they were thinking a lot about what would happen if scientists were to come out and say this might have come from a lab. We can't tell.
It also seems like there's some sensitivity in protecting their ability to continue to do gain-of-function research. The colloquy we listened to, where there was an unwillingness to kind of engage in the question of whether or not the research that was being conducted there was in fact gain-of-function research or some other research which is obviously potentially dangerous enough or not done at a safety level that could protect the public from what we've been dealing with for the last 3 years. Can you weigh in on what this disagreement is about? What does constitute gain-of-function research, and in your professional opinion, what was going on in those labs?
So we see from even their private Slack exchanges that these scientists were worried about these dangerous and risky virus experiments. They said it only takes one mistake for a virus to leak and cause outbreaks in people. But they found themselves in this difficult position of having talked in private to funders of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, to proponents of this gain-of-function research, who were very aggressively shutting down any notion of a lab origin. And so we see that their public and private thoughts were in conflict. And now the question is really, has the science changed at all? Has the science changed, and have they been validated? And the answer is no. Actually, up to today, there's still no way to tell whether the virus came from a lab or from nature. So what I hope to see from this step on is future hearings dealing with more of the non-public evidence that has been gathered by the US government. So we heard at the hearing that there is non-public evidence that needs to be looked at. And I hope that will be the next step.
Absolutely. That's what I thought, I expected and hoped, maybe naively, that we were getting a few weeks ago. And the law, obligating declassification and explanation of what the government has that was bipartisan, signed by Biden. There was a deadline to release it. And instead, all we got was like another report, again, summarizing evidence we already know without explaining what caused the FBI and Energy to make a different conclusion than other agencies. And I have to think, and I'm really curious for your opinion on this, something that has been reported by the Wall Street Journal and other places that points to lab leak origin is those scientists getting sick with a COVID-like illness, much earlier than the wet market, et cetera. That one of those scientists has publicly denied that he got sick now. But if the U.S. government has intelligence or evidence that the Chinese government had this intelligence, obviously that would be such a significant, tipping the scales toward lab leak. Do you think that information, that is something the U.S. government does know that they haven't disclosed yet? Is that possibly what led some of the agencies to make a different call?
Based on what I have heard from others privately, I do think that those names are accurate. So I know that 2 of the 3 scientists have put up public denials and in fact claim that they never worked with live viruses. They're just the computer folks. But this is not true. If you go through the literature, you can tell that these scientists were the ones directly handling these live viruses, very similar to the pandemic virus. And so I hope that the intel agency can declassify more information and to engender more trust from the public in them. Because what we're seeing now is that the FBI and DOE have both assessed a lab origin more likely than not. They both have the strongest scientific expertise amongst all the intel agencies. So what exactly is the evidence that has led them to this conclusion? And I believe that quite a few key pieces of evidence are still not public, still not declassified.
Well, it is interesting that witness, Anderson, says that he was part of the group that advised the FBI on what the origin was. And of course, the FBI came out saying that it was more likely than not that it was lab leak. What do you make? We were hoping, as Robbie pointed out, to get more insight into what made those government agencies come to that particular conclusion. But what do you make of the fact that there's this person here who's clearly implicated in a letter going the other direction, saying that it was natural origin, giving advice to an agency that ultimately chose to weigh in the other way?
So I think there needs to be some clarification here in terms of what they mean by whether they advised that agency. So some of these agencies did a lot of interviews, and I believe that is what happened for Bob Gary and for Christine Anderson, is that they were interviewed, but they were not paid consultants. So they were not paid to advise these agencies. So what that means is that these agencies spoke at length. So these scientists interviewed them, tried to understand their arguments and what evidence they based their interpretations on, and saw all of that and still determined scientifically that this was not pointing towards a natural origin. So I think that the lack of the classification and the kind of wording that Intel agency uses, like no evidence, is always erring on the side of caution. So even if they have searched but have met obstacles, they don't tell you that. They just say that we haven't found evidence, but it doesn't mean that there is no actual evidence to be found. So I think it is worth clarifying that the available evidence is either missing or what is known doesn't strongly point towards a natural origin.
We also were talking a little bit yesterday as the hearing was ongoing about a kind of viral clip of Marjorie Taylor Greene weighing in at the hearing. There was a lot of pushback, arguments that there was misinformation in the content of what she said. Can you weigh in on Marjorie Taylor Greene's characterization of what happened in the hearing?
I think that that's certainly some errors in Greene's speech, and that's why I wish that more other scientists had been brought in to sort of balance out the proximal origin authors, to sort of counter them and point out where they've made missteps or where they are wrong in their statements. So from what I gather, her stance was that it's troubling that a bioweapons general was called in to head the Wuhan Institute during the crisis, and that there were very closely related viruses being worked with in the lab there, and that members of the IC do assess a lab origin as more likely. So I also think that these are notable, but again, it's difficult to say that this definitely points towards a lab origin. So what I think needs to be done now is doing a very systematic search within the US for communications, documents, research proposals, reports that could point us towards the origin of COVID-19, that could tell us about whether dangerous experiments had been done in Wuhan.
Alina Chan, thank you so much for joining us to discuss this subject. We really appreciate it.
Thanks again.